The wind hit 60 miles an hour, driving snow so fine it could suffocate a man standing upright. The temperature plunged from 40 degrees to 35 below zero in hours. Across Dakota Territory, families burned their furniture and still froze to death within sight of their own front doors. By morning, 235 people would be dead. But inside Kate Vogt's soddy, her 3 children slept on warm brick, their breathing slow and even. Her fire had died 14 hours ago. The interior held at 68 degrees. 6 months earlier, Elmer Hoskins had laughed when she ordered 4,000 bricks. A 2-ton stove, he'd said. You might as well build your own coffin. This is what happened. Across Dakota Territory, families huddled around cast iron stoves that devoured wood faster than anyone could feed them. Children froze to death within sight of their own front doors. By morning, 235 people would be dead. Inside Kate Vogt's soddy, her 3 children slept on a platform of warm brick, their breathing slow and even. The fire had died 14 hours ago. The interior held at 68 degrees. Kate stood at the frost-covered window, watching the white chaos swallow the prairie. A quarter-mile south, barely visible through the driving snow, the Anderson family's soddy sat dark against the storm. They had a brand-new cast-iron stove, purchased on Elmer Hoskins's recommendation. By now, they would be burning furniture. Kate touched the wall beside her. Warm. She pressed her palm to the massive brick structure that dominated half her 12 by 16-foot home. The surface radiated steady heat, gentle as a living thing. 2 tons of brick holding the memory of last evening's fire, releasing it hour by hour into the frigid night. 6 months earlier, Elmer Hoskins had laughed when she ordered 4,000 bricks. A 2-ton stove, he'd said. You might as well build your own coffin. Kate watched the storm scream across the prairie and wondered how many of her neighbors were dying right now and whether Hoskins was among them. But 6 months earlier, Kate Vogt had been a widow with $75, 3 children, and a cracked iron stove that couldn't keep ice from forming on the inside of her walls. The letter came in late March of 1887, Kate's sister in Kansas, writing to offer what she called a practical solution. Come south, the letter said. Bring the children. Heinrich is gone, and there's no shame in admitting you can't prove up a claim alone. The children need a proper home, not a dirt box on a frozen prairie. Kate read the letter 3 times, then fed it to the stove. Heinrich had been dead 8 months. Typhoid took him in 11 days during the summer of '86, turning a healthy 34-year-old farmer into a corpse so thin his wedding ring slipped off his finger. Kate had buried him on the northeast corner of their claim, facing the sunrise, facing Germany, facing the world they'd left behind when they sailed from Bremen in 1883. The claim was 160 acres of Dakota Territory grass, 8 miles from the town of Eureka, 14 months from the completion of their 5-year residency requirement. If Kate stayed, survived, and continued working the land, the government would grant her a patent. The farm would be hers, free and clear, worth more than anything she would ever own otherwise. If she left, she would lose everything. The 4 years already invested, the house Heinrich built with his own hands, the grave where he lay. So she stayed. And the winter of '86 to '87 nearly killed them all. The cast-iron stove Heinrich had purchased in Eureka was adequate for a family with a working father, 2 horses, and the means to haul 6 cords of firewood from the railroad depot. It was not adequate for a widow who had sold the horses to pay for her husband's burial. Kate spent that winter feeding the stove every 2 hours, waking at midnight and 3 in the morning to add wood, watching her pile of twisted hay and buffalo chips and corn cobs dwindle toward nothing. By February, she was borrowing from neighbors. By March, she owed $12 she didn't have, and the children had been sick for so long she could barely remember what they looked like healthy. Johann was 10, old enough to help haul fuel and tend the fire when his mother collapsed from exhaustion. Anna was 7, old enough to cook what little food they had and keep 18-month-old Friedrich from crawling too close to the stove. The 3 of them learned to sleep in shifts, learned to survive on cornmeal mush and dried beans, learned to wake at the sound of wind rattling the Saudi's single window. When spring came, Kate had lost 20 pounds and gained a debt she couldn't pay. Her stove showed cracks along the firebox. The efficiency that had once kept the interior at 50 degrees now barely managed 40 on the coldest nights. She calculated the numbers 100 times, hoping they would change. A new stove cost $25 to $30. 8 cords of wood, the minimum a widow with children would need, cost $20 at the railroad depot. Coal was $6 to $8 per ton when available, but the railroad blocked up with snow half the winter, and supply was never guaranteed. Minimum cost to survive next winter, $45 to $50. Food for a family of 4 from October through April, $40 to $50. Kate had $63 remaining after repaying her debts to the neighbors. The math was impossible. She needed $90 to $100 to survive. She had 63, and there was no way to earn the difference with 3 children and no horses and no husband and no family within 500 miles. In May, Kate walked the 8 miles to Eureka to price supplies at Hoskins's general store. Elmer Hoskins had arrived in Dakota Territory in 1882, a year before the Vogts. He considered himself an expert on prairie survival, having witnessed dozens of families fail and leave, which in his mind made him more knowledgeable than the families who had actually survived. He kept careful records of who bought what, and he enjoyed telling people what they needed before they knew they needed it. He looked up when Kate entered, tracking dirt from the spring thaw across his clean wooden floor. His expression shifted through several stages: recognition, pity, calculation. "Mrs. Vogt," he said. "Surprised to see you still here? Most folks figured you'd head back to your people after Heinrich passed." Kate asked about winter preparation costs, stoves, fuel, what she would need. Hoskins leaned against his counter and began his lecture. "A decent iron stove runs $25 to $30, he said. "You'll need 8 cords minimum for a widow with children. That's $20 in wood, more if the railroad prices go up. Coal's more efficient per pound, but we can't guarantee supply once the snow starts blocking the tracks." Kate asked what it all added up to. Hoskins calculated on a scrap of paper, enjoying himself. "Figure $45 to $50 to survive winter proper," he said. "That's assuming nothing breaks, nobody gets sick, and you don't burn through your wood too fast on the cold nights." He looked at her, waiting. Kate said she had $63. Hoskins shook his head slowly, the way a doctor might when delivering a diagnosis. "Your husband was a good man, Mrs. Vogt. No shame in going back to your people. Land office will release your claim. Someone else can prove it up." Kate thanked him for his time and walked out without buying anything. The 8 miles back to the homestead took 3 hours in the spring mud. Kate walked past the Anderson place, past the Lindstrom place, past the abandoned Jensen claim where the husband had died of pneumonia and the wife had taken the children back to Minnesota. Half the claims in McPherson County would fail within 5 years. The Dakotas ate people and spit out their bones. She was nearly home when she passed the Zimmerman soddy. Old Mrs. Zimmerman sat on a wooden chair outside the door, knitting in the May sunshine. She nodded at Kate as she passed. The Zimmermans had come from the same region of Russia as the Vogts, had sailed on the same ship, had settled claims 3 miles apart. They were the only neighbors who still spoke Plautdietsch with Kate, the Low German dialect that felt like home. Kate stopped. "Mrs. Zimmerman," she said, "that stove in your house, the big brick one, how does it work?" The old woman looked up from her knitting. The lines in her face softened. "The peck? My husband built it. One fire in the morning. The bricks remember the heat all day." Kate thought about her father. She had been 12 years old in the Molotchna colony when she watched him lay the brick for a petch in the Harder family's house. He had been a petchnik, a stove maker. His hands were always rough with dried clay. He had built a dozen stoves before Kate turned 16 and married Heinrich and moved to a farm of their own. Her father had explained the principle once. The fire burned hot, over 1,000 degrees, much hotter than an iron stove. The heat traveled through channels inside the brick, trapped by the labyrinth, forced to surrender its warmth before escaping up the chimney. Then the bricks released that warmth for hours, slowly, steadily, long after the fire had died. Kate asked Mrs. Zimmerman if she thought such a stove could be built here, in Dakota. Mrs. Zimmerman's husband Peter appeared in the doorway. He was 71 years old, too frail to build anything anymore, but his eyes were still sharp. "Come inside," he said. "I'll show you how it works." The Zimmerman peck dominated their soddy like a throne. It was smaller than the stoves Kate remembered from Russia, but the principle was the same. A firebox the size of a small trunk, a maze of internal channels, a flat platform on top where a person could sleep on the coldest nights. Peter Zimmerman had built it in Kansas before they moved north. He had built 3 others in the Molochna colony before emigrating. His hands shook now, but he remembered everything. He drew diagrams in the dirt floor of the soddy. "The firebox here," he said, marking with his finger. "Not big, the size of a trunk. The smoke cannot go straight up. It must travel." He traced a snaking path. Back and forth, 6 channels. Each channel the heat must pass through. Kate watched him draw. The channels turned back on themselves like a river winding through a canyon. "By the time the smoke reaches the chimney," Zimmerman said, "it has given most of its heat to the bricks. The chimney opening is small, just enough for draft. Most of the heat stays inside." Kate asked how many bricks. Zimmerman calculated silently, his lips moving. For a sleeping platform big enough for children? 4,000, maybe more. Kate did the math in her head. 4,000 bricks at $8 per thousand, $32. She had 63. It was possible. She asked how long it would take to build. Zimmerman studied her. A man who knows what he's doing, maybe 2 weeks. A woman alone who has never built one? He shrugged. 2 months, maybe 3. Kate asked if he could teach her. "I cannot build anymore," Zimmerman said. "My hands shake. But I can draw. I can explain. And when you make mistakes, I can tell you how to fix them." Kate looked at the petch. The surface radiated gentle warmth even now, in late May. The Zimmermans had fired it that morning, 8 hours ago, and it still held the heat. She thought about the numbers again. A petch would burn 3 to 4 cords of wood per season instead of 8. That saved $10 to $12 annually. The stove never needed tending at night. For the first time in 2 years, she could sleep more than 2 hours at a stretch. But the risks were enormous. If she spent $32 on bricks and failed to build a functioning stove, she would have no money left for a conventional alternative. She would freeze to death in her own home while her children watched. It was a gamble. Everything on one hand. Kate thanked the Zimmermans and walked home. That night, she sat in her soddy with the cracked iron stove and the children asleep on the floor and the May wind pushing through gaps in the sod walls. She thought about her father's hands covered in clay dust. She thought about winters in the Molochna colony, how the petch kept them warm when the snow drifted to the roofline. She thought about Heinrich and his grave and the 14 months remaining on the claim. In the morning, she walked the 8 miles to Eureka and ordered 4,000 bricks. Hoskins's expression when she told him what she wanted was worth the walk. 4,000 bricks, Mrs. Vogt, he said. For what? Building a church? Kate didn't explain. She paid $32, arranged to pick up loads as she could haul them, and ignored the laughter that followed her out of the store. The news spread through the county within a week. The German widow had gone mad. She was building a brick monument to her own foolishness. She would be dead by Christmas. Martha Lindstrom heard the news and came to visit. Martha was a Swedish widow who had arrived in Dakota Territory in 1884 with her husband. He died of something the doctor called heart failure in the winter of '85, leaving Martha alone on a 160-acre claim with no children and no particular reason to stay. She stayed anyway. She had proved up her claim the previous year and now owned her land outright. The other women in the county regarded her as either an inspiration or a warning, depending on temperament. She rode her mule to Kate's soddy on a gray morning in early June, tied it to the post Heinrich had sunk, and knocked on the door. Kate opened it and found Martha studying the pile of bricks that had accumulated near the southwest corner of the house. "I heard you're building something," Martha said. Kate invited her in. Inside, the cracked iron stove sat cold. The children were down at the creek, hauling water. Kate had been mixing mortar from clay and sand, and her hands were caked with gray-brown paste. Martha looked at the mess and shook her head. "I survived 2 winters with an iron stove," she said. "It's about having enough wood, not building monuments." Kate explained the principle of the petch, the thermal mass, the channels that trapped heat, the sleeping platform that stayed warm all night. Martha listened with her arms crossed. "I've seen Russian stoves," she said when Kate finished. "They're enormous." "You don't have a house, Kate. You have a dirt box. Where are you going to fit 2 tons of brick?" Kate showed her the design she'd sketched from Zimmerman's instructions. The petch would take up a quarter of the interior. It was larger than ideal, but it would fit. Martha pointed at the numbers Kate had scratched on the paper. "That's $50 you could spend on food and wood like sensible people." Kate said she would burn half the wood her neighbors used. She would sleep through the night for the first time since Heinrich died. The stove would last 40 years. Martha walked outside and looked at the pile of bricks. A fraction of what Kate needed was sitting there. The rest was still at Hoskins's store, waiting to be hauled. "What if the weight collapses your floor?" she asked. Kate explained that she was pouring a separate foundation, clay and stone below the sod, wide enough to distribute the weight. Martha mounted her mule and looked down at Kate. "You'll be crawling to Hoskins' store by Christmas," she said, "begging for coal like everyone else. But I hope I'm wrong." She rode away, and Kate went back to mixing mortar. That afternoon, she began digging. The foundation needed to go 2 feet below the existing floor level. The soil was thick with prairie grass roots and clay and rocks the size of her fist. Kate's shovel hit stone with every 3rd stroke. By sunset, she had excavated a hole 4 feet by 6 feet, 18 inches deep. Her back screamed. Her palms were blistered through her work gloves. Johann found her kneeling in the hole, unable to stand. "Mother?" he said. Kate told him to bring water. She drank half a bucket and spent 10 minutes stretching her spine until she could straighten it. The next morning, she went back to digging. Word of Kate's project reached Orville Pratt by the 2nd week of June. Pratt was a land speculator from St. Paul who had arrived in McPherson County in 1884 with capital and no intention of farming. He bought failed homesteads at tax sales, improved them minimally, and resold them to incoming settlers at a profit. He currently held mortgages on 3 claims in the county and was watching a dozen others for signs of abandonment. He had been watching Kate's claim since Heinrich died, a widow with 3 children on 160 acres, 14 months from proving up. The house was sound, the well produced clean water, and 40 acres had already been broken for cultivation. If Kate failed, Pratt could acquire the improved claim for back taxes and sell it for 5 times what he paid. He had been patient. Widows usually gave up by the 2nd winter, but Kate was still here, and now she was spending her remaining money on bricks. Pratt found her after church services in Eureka on the 3rd Sunday in June. The German-Russian families held their own service in Plautich at the Zimmerman farm, but Kate had started attending the American church in town, hoping to improve her English and her children's prospects. "Mrs. Vogt," Pratt said, stepping into her path as she left the building. "I've been meaning to speak with you." Kate recognized him. Everyone knew what Pratt did. "Your husband's claim," he began. "My claim," Kate said. "I'm proving it up." Of course, of course." Pratt smiled like a man explaining something to a child. "But I wonder if you've considered alternatives. I could offer you a fair price, enough to get you and the children to Kansas in comfort. A fresh start." Kate said the claim was not for sale. Pratt's smile didn't falter. "Not today, perhaps, but winters are hard. Children get sick. A woman alone." He let the sentence hang, full of implications. Kate walked away. That afternoon, Pratt told anyone who would listen that the Vogt widow was building a monument to her own foolishness. He predicted she'd be gone by spring, and he'd own that quarter section for back taxes. "Spending her last money on bricks," he said. "A foreign contraption that'll burn down her soddy or collapse through the floor. Either way, I give her until February." Some people nodded. Others looked uncomfortable. The German-Russian families said nothing but noticed who laughed at their countrywoman. The gossip accelerated. Women at the general store stopped talking when Kate entered. The schoolteacher asked Johann if his mother was feeling all right. A neighbor, Mr. Anderson, offered to buy Kate's milk cow before she had to eat it. Kate stopped going to town except for absolute necessities. She worked alone, 14 hours a day, hauling bricks in a borrowed handcart, mixing mortar by the bucket, consulting Zimmerman's sketches until she had them memorized. Old Peter Zimmerman came to visit once a week, walked around the construction site, pointed out where she'd gone wrong. Kate tore out her mistakes and rebuilt them. She learned to check the level of every course. She learned to feel when the mortar was too wet or too dry. She learned to trust her hands when her eyes were too tired to focus. Johann hauled stones from the creek bed, 2 miles each direction. Anna took over all cooking and childcare. Friedrich toddled around the construction site, fascinated by the growing structure. At the German-Russian community gatherings, opinions divided. The older settlers remembered the Pech with nostalgia. The younger ones, eager to assimilate, called it backward. Old Zimmerman stood up at one gathering and addressed the doubters directly. In Russia, he said, we had winters that would freeze this whole territory solid. The Pech kept us alive when iron stoves failed. This is not madness. This is wisdom. A younger man shook his head. That was Russia, he said. This is America. We have better ways now. Zimmerman looked at him with something between pity and contempt. You'll see, he said. When the real cold comes, you'll see. Kate kept building. By late July, she had completed the foundation and laid the first 800 bricks. The firebox was operational, lined with refractory brick that could withstand temperatures over 1,000 degrees. The ash clean-out at the base worked smoothly. The first of the internal channels was taking shape. But Kate had reached the point where memory failed her. She sat in the half-finished structure at sunset, staring at Zimmerman's drawings, unable to remember which direction the channels turned after the firebox. Her father had shown her a dozen times, but she had been 12 years old and more interested in playing than learning. Now she would give anything for 1 hour with him. The next morning, she walked to the Zimmerman farm. Peter Zimmerman sat in his chair, hands shaking, but his mind still sharp. He listened to Kate describe where she was stuck, then picked up a stick and drew in the dirt. The smoke rises, he said. Hot air rises. So the first channel goes up. He drew a vertical line. Then it must come down. He drew a curve. The smoke doesn't want to go down. The channel must be narrow, so the draft pulls it. Kate watched him trace the pathway. Up, across, down, across, up, across, down. 6 turns in all before the chimney. If you make the down channels too wide, Zimmerman said, the smoke backs up. You get smoke in the house. If you make them too narrow, the draft is too strong, and the heat escapes too fast. Kate asked what width was correct. 8 to 10 inches for the down channels, Zimmerman said. 12 to 14 for the up channels. The difference in size creates the pressure that moves the smoke. Kate thanked him and walked home. She tore out the previous day's work, measured carefully, rebuilt. It cost her 3 days. By mid-August, she had laid 2,400 bricks. The channel system was complete, snaking back and forth inside the structure like a river, finding its path through a canyon. She tested the draft with a candle held at the firebox opening. The flame pulled toward the channels, steady and strong. The physical toll was becoming visible. Kate's hands were wrapped in rags that soaked through with blood by afternoon. Her back had settled into a permanent ache that flared into agony when she lifted anything heavier than 20 pounds. She had lost 15 pounds since June, and her dresses hung loose on her frame. She slept 4 hours a night when she slept at all. Johann showed signs of exhaustion, too. He was 10 years old, hauling stones and mixing mortar, and tending the vegetable garden that would keep them fed through winter. His childhood had ended when his father died. Now he worked like a man 3 times his age. Anna, at 7, had become the mother of the household. She cooked, she cleaned, she kept Friedrich out of danger. She brought water to Kate and Johann when they forgot to drink. She never complained. In late August, Kate dropped a full bucket of mortar. The clay and lime mixture splattered across the ground, wasted. Kate stood looking at it, too exhausted to react. The bucket had cost her nothing, but the lime had cost money, and she had no money left. $32 for bricks, $8 for sand and lime and other materials, $3 for food since June. She had $20 remaining, and she needed all of it for wood. Johann found her standing there and asked what was wrong. Kate told him she needed more lime and had no way to buy it. Johann thought for a moment. Then he said there was white rock along the creek bed, near where he collected the stones for the foundation. It looked like chalk. Kate walked to the creek that afternoon, found the deposit, scraped samples into a bucket. At home, she ground the rock to powder, mixed it with water, tested it against the remaining commercial lime. It worked. Not as well as the processed product, but well enough. The setback cost her 3 days of production, but she didn't need to spend money she didn't have. September arrived. 12 weeks since Kate had started building. The first light frost came on September 28th, painting the prairie grass white at dawn. The patch was 60% complete. Kate worked from first light until she couldn't see her hands in front of her face. She worked by lantern when she could spare the oil. She worked until she collapsed, and Johann helped her to bed, and she lay awake calculating whether she would finish in time. The sleeping platform required an arch. Kate had never built an arch before. She practiced with loose bricks, stacking them in a curve over a wooden form she built from scraps. The first attempt collapsed when she removed the form. So did the second. On the third try, she studied the way the bricks leaned against each other, the way each one transferred its weight to its neighbor. She adjusted the angle of each brick by fractions of an inch. The curve held. In the second week of September, help arrived from an unexpected source. Martha Lindstrom appeared at Kate's door with a loaf of fresh bread and an offer. "My husband's brother has a cart," Martha said. "He said he'd haul your remaining bricks from town." Kate asked why. Martha shrugged. "Because you haven't quit. And because my stove needs repairs, I can't afford either." The help came with no contract, no promise of repayment. Martha's brother-in-law, a silent man named Eric, made 4 trips to Eureka over the following week. He hauled 1,600 bricks in a cart pulled by a mule older than Johann. He refused payment. "Just remember us if this contraption actually works," he said. By the 1st of October, Kate had all her materials on site. The sleeping platform arch was complete, solid enough for 3 children to sleep on without shifting. The exterior walls rose to their full height. Only the chimney connection and the final plastering remained. October 10th, 1887. The last brick was laid. Kate stood back and looked at what she had built. 2 tons of brick and clay and mortar, 4 feet wide, 6 feet long, 5 feet tall. The sleeping platform extended from one side like a bench, its surface smooth and level. The firebox door, salvaged from the cracked iron stove, hung in its frame. The chimney connected to the existing flue Heinrich had installed years ago. It was finished, but the mortar needed to cure. Fire it too hot too fast and the structure would crack. Kate lit a small fire, barely more than kindling, and let it burn for 2 hours. The next day she built a slightly larger fire. The day after, larger still. For 3 days she tended tiny flames, increasing their size gradually, watching for cracks in the mortar. The bricks warmed, the structure held. October 14th. Kate loaded 30 pounds of split wood into the firebox and lit it. The flames roared to life, louder and hotter than any fire she had built in the iron stove. The temperature inside the firebox climbed past 800 degrees, past 1,000, past 1,100. She could feel the heat radiating through the brick even from 3 feet away. 3 hours later, the fire died to coals. Kate touched the sleeping platform. Warm. She touched it at midnight, still warm. Johann slept on the platform that night, the first warm sleep of his life in Dakota Territory. The stove worked, but winter hadn't truly arrived yet. The skeptics were still waiting, and somewhere beyond the horizon, the worst blizzard in American history was gathering strength. November came to Dakota Territory like an unwelcome guest, settling in with no intention of leaving. The first real test arrived on November 15th. Kate woke to frost on the inside of the window and a temperature outside that had dropped to 10 degrees below zero overnight. She loaded 35 pounds of split wood into the Peach's firebox, arranged the kindling, struck a match. The flames caught and grew, filling the firebox with heat that climbed past 800 degrees, past 1,000. The roar of combustion echoed off the sod walls. 2 hours later, the fire had burned down to embers. Kate closed the firebox door and waited. By evening, the interior of the soddy held at 62 degrees. The children did their lessons at the table without shivering. Friedrich played on the floor without needing to be wrapped in blankets. Kate touched the sleeping platform, warm as skin. She woke at midnight, the habit of 2 winters with an iron stove still carved into her body. The soddy was dark and silent. She reached out and touched the brick, still warm. For the first time since Heinrich died, Kate slept through the night. By the end of November, the pattern had established itself. 1 fire in the evening, 30 to 40 pounds of wood, 12 to 14 hours of steady warmth. The children stopped getting sick. Kate's persistent cough, the one she'd carried since the previous February, finally faded. The math proved out exactly as Zimmerman had promised. November consumption, 1/3 of a cord. At that rate, she would burn 3 cords through the entire heating season, $7.50 in fuel. A quarter-mile south, the Anderson family burned through their first 2 cords before Thanksgiving. Mr. Anderson made a trip to town for more, his cartwheels cutting ruts in the frozen mud. Hoskins noted the sale in his ledger. By December, the Andersons had purchased 4 cords. Kate's single cord remained 2/3 full. Word spread through the county, but the skeptics held firm. Hoskins told anyone who asked that the German widow had gotten lucky with a mild start to winter. "Wait until January," he said. "Those foreign stoves might work in November, but a real Dakota cold snap? She'll be back for coal like everyone else." Pratt, the speculator, made similar predictions at the saloon in Eureka. "She got lucky," he said. "Mild weather and that Russian contraption. Won't last. I give her until February." But the German-Russian families noticed something different. They noticed that Kate's children looked healthy. They noticed that Kate herself had stopped losing weight, had regained some color in her cheeks. They noticed that when other widows visited Kate's soddy, they stayed longer than courtesy required. Martha Lindstrom came to visit 3 days before Christmas. She stepped through the door, stopped, and stood perfectly still. "Mother of God," she said, "it's warm." "Actually warm." Kate showed her the sleeping platform. "The children slept there in shifts," she explained. "The brick held body temperature all night. No one had been sick since October." Martha touched the surface of the petch. She pulled her hand back, surprised, then touched it again. "How much wood have you burned?" she asked. Kate showed her the woodpile outside, still more than half remaining. Martha left without saying much, but her expression had changed. The skepticism was still there, but something else had joined it, something that looked like doubt in her own certainty. Late December brought the old-timers' warnings. Experienced settlers noticed things that newcomers missed. The birds had migrated south earlier than usual. Animals wore thicker fur than anyone could remember. Moss grew heavy on the north sides of trees along the river breaks. Old Zimmerman walked to Kate's soddy on the 28th of December, his breath clouding in the cold. "Bad winter coming," he said. "The animals know." Kate asked how bad. Zimmerman shook his head. "I've seen 60 winters," he said. "The animals are more frightened than I've ever seen them." The first week of January brought a series of moderate storms. Cold, but manageable. Roads stayed passable. The mail still came through. Then, on January 11th, the weather changed. Kate woke to warmth, not the warmth of the petch, but warmth from outside. She opened the door and felt air that must have been 30 degrees, maybe warmer. The sun was shining. Water dripped from the eaves where frost had accumulated. Johann asked if he could play outside. Kate said yes, but the unease she felt wouldn't leave her. This warmth was wrong. January in Dakota Territory didn't feel like this. It felt like a trap. That night she fired the petch with a full load of wood, even though the mild temperature didn't require it. She didn't know why. Instinct, maybe. Or something her father had taught her that she couldn't quite remember. January 12th, 1888. Kate woke at 6 in the morning to a temperature of 32 degrees. Unseasonably warm. The sky showed pale blue through the frost-free window. She fired the petch with a light load. The warmth meant she didn't need a full burn, and she wanted to conserve wood for the storms that would surely follow this false spring. Johann ate his breakfast, pulled on his coat, and prepared to walk the 2 miles to school. The one-room schoolhouse sat on a hill northeast of the Vogt claim, serving a dozen families scattered across 10 square miles of prairie. Kate watched him go, his breath barely visible in the warm air. Anna helped Friedrich with his porridge. The morning passed in quiet routine. At 10 o'clock, Kate looked up from her mending and saw clouds on the northwest horizon. They were moving fast, faster than any clouds she had seen before. And they weren't gray or white, they were black, shot through with purple, a wall of darkness consuming the sky. Kate set down her needle. She walked outside and stood in the yard, watching the wall approach. The air had gone completely still. No wind, no birds, nothing. Then she heard it, a sound like a locomotive growing louder by the second. Kate ran. She ran toward the Anderson farm, screaming Johann's name, screaming for anyone who could hear. The wall was a mile away now, half a mile, a quarter mile. She could see it clearly, not clouds but snow, fine as flour, driven by winds that bent the dead prairie grass flat to the ground. The wall hit her like a fist. Kate went down on her knees, blinded, unable to breathe. The snow wasn't falling, it was flying horizontally, filling her nose and mouth and eyes. The temperature dropped so fast she could feel her skin tighten. She couldn't see. She couldn't hear anything but the wind. She couldn't find the direction she'd been running. Kate crawled. Her hands found frozen grass, dirt, more grass. She had no idea which way led home. The soddy could have been 10 feet away or 100 yards. The world had vanished into white. She kept crawling. Her fingers touched something solid. A fence post. Heinrich's fence, marking the edge of their property. Kate grabbed the post and held on. She knew this fence. She had walked it 1,000 times. If she followed it east, she would reach the corner near the barn. From there, 40 feet to the house. She pulled herself along the fence, hand over hand, counting posts. 1, 2, 3. The wind screamed so loud she couldn't hear her own voice. At the 7th post, she found the corner. She let go of the fence and crawled toward where the house should be. Her hand hit sod, the wall. She followed it to the door, wrenched it open, fell inside. Anna was screaming. Friedrich was crying. Kate slammed the door against the wind and leaned against it, gasping. The peck radiated heat into the room, steady and indifferent to the apocalypse outside. Johann was not home. Kate looked at the clock on the wall. 11:30. School would have started at 8. By now, Johann had been inside the schoolhouse for 3 hours. But the teacher, Miss Peterson, could not keep the children overnight. There was no food at the school, minimal fuel for the small iron stove, no way to shelter a dozen children through a blizzard of unknown duration. She would have sent them home at the first sign of storm, which meant Johann was somewhere between the schoolhouse and home. 2 miles of open prairie, 0 visibility, temperature falling toward 20 below. Kate looked at Anna, 7 years old, terrified but silent. Kate gave her instructions. Do not open the door for anyone but Johann or me. Do not let the fire die. Keep Friedrich on the sleeping platform. If I don't return by morning, walk to the Lindstroms when the storm breaks. Anna nodded. Her lips were pressed tight, but she didn't cry. Kate found the rope Heinrich had used to tie their horses. She knotted one end around her waist, the other around the doorpost. 60 feet of rope. Not enough, but all she had. She opened the door and stepped into the white. The cold hit her like nothing she had ever felt. This wasn't winter. This was the absence of warmth itself, a cold so absolute it burned. Kate felt for the fence line, found it, followed it away from the house. The rope played out behind her. 20 feet, 40, 60. The rope went taut. She had reached the end. Kate tied herself to the fence post and began shouting, Johann! Johann! The wind tore her voice away. She couldn't hear it herself. She shouted until her throat was raw, until the cold made her lungs ache, until she was certain that no one could hear anything in this howling white void. Then she heard something, a sound that might have been a voice, might have been the wind. Kate untied herself from the fence and followed the sound. 20 feet. 30. She was beyond the rope now, beyond any connection to home. If she lost her direction, she would die within sight of her own door. The sound came again. Closer. Johann. A shape materialized from the white, two shapes. Johann half carrying a smaller child. The Anderson boy, Niels, who was 6 years old and lived a quarter-mile past the Vogt claim. Johann's lips were blue. Frost covered his eyebrows and lashes. He was moving on instinct, putting one foot in front of the other because stopping meant death. Niels was barely conscious, his weight sagging against Johann's side. Kate grabbed them both. She tried to find the fence, but the white had swallowed everything. She couldn't tell up from down, let alone east from west. She picked a direction and walked. 50 feet. 100. The snow packed against her face, filling her eyes, freezing her lashes shut. She pried them open with her fingers and kept walking. Her foot hit something, a post. Heinrich's fence. Kate followed it, hand over hand, dragging Johann, dragging Niels. The post led her to the corner, to the wall, to the door. She threw it open and pushed the boys inside. The heat of the petch hit her like a physical force. Kate slammed the door and leaned against it, breathing in air that wasn't trying to kill her. Anna was crying now, silent tears running down her face. Johann collapsed on the floor. Niels wasn't moving. Kate stripped the wet clothes from both boys. She wrapped them in every blanket she owned. She lifted Niels, he weighed nothing, a bundle of frozen bones, and laid him directly on the sleeping platform. The bricks were 110 degrees, warm enough to revive, not hot enough to burn. Within an hour, Niels was conscious. Within 2 hours, he was crying for his mother. Kate added more wood to the firebox. The flames roared, feeding the thermal mass, storing heat for the night ahead. Outside, the temperature continued to fall. By 6 in the evening, the thermometer on the porch read 20 degrees below zero. By midnight, 35 below. The wind held steady at 50 miles an hour, driving snow so fine it found gaps in the sod walls that had never leaked before. Kate stuffed rags into every crack. The petch radiated its heat into the room, patient and steady. The fire had died at 4 in the afternoon. 8 hours later, the interior held at 62 degrees. Kate sat in the warmth, unable to sleep, watching her children and the Anderson boy breathe. Across the prairie, other families were not so fortunate. The Anderson family's iron stove consumed wood at twice its normal rate. By evening, Mr. Anderson had burned through everything he had cut and stacked. He started on the furniture, the chairs his wife had brought from Minnesota, the table where his children ate their meals. Mrs. Anderson stuffed rags into the gaps around the door and windows. The wind blew through anyway. The temperature inside their soddy dropped to 42 degrees and kept falling. They didn't know where Niels was. They couldn't see the Vogt place through the snow. They couldn't leave to search without dying. Mr. Anderson burned the door frame, then the shelves, then the bed frame. In Eureka, even the buildings provided little protection. 3 people froze to death walking between the saloon and their homes, a distance of less than 100 feet. The storm killed teachers who dismissed their students too late. It killed children who started home before the storm hit and were caught in the open. It killed farmers who stepped outside to check on livestock and lost their way between barn and house. 235 people died across Dakota Territory, Nebraska, Minnesota, and Iowa. Kate's children slept through the night on a platform of warm brick. At 6 in the morning on January 13th, the wind died. Kate opened the door a crack. A snowdrift reached to the roof, blocking half the doorway. The temperature stood at 30 degrees below zero. The sky was pale blue and utterly still. Inside, the petch had released its heat through 14 hours of hell. The interior temperature had dropped to 54 degrees, cold, but survivable. Kate lit a new fire, and within an hour the soddy climbed back to 70. She would not leave the house for 3 days. When she finally dug out, she learned what had happened to her neighbors. Mr. Anderson reached Kate's soddy on January 14th. He had spent 14 hours digging through drifts that buried his door to the roof. His face was burned with frostbite, white patches on his cheeks and nose that would scar him for life. He had not slept since the storm began. "My boy," he said when Kate opened the door. "Niels. He didn't come home." Kate brought him inside. The warmth of the petch hit Anderson like a physical blow. He stopped just inside the door, swaying, unable to process what he was feeling. Kate led him to the sleeping platform where Niels lay curled under blankets, sleeping peacefully. Anderson collapsed. He fell to his knees beside the platform and wept, great heaving sobs that shook his entire body. He gathered his son in his arms and held him, rocking back and forth, unable to speak. When he finally recovered, he looked around the soddy. Really looked. He touched the wall. Warm. He touched the floor near the stove. Warm. He stepped outside into the 30 below air, then back inside. "How?" he asked. Kate explained. The thermal mass, the channels that trapped heat, the slow release over hours and hours. Anderson stared at the structure as if seeing it for the first time. "We burned everything," he said. "The chairs, the table. We almost burned the door." His voice cracked. "I told my wife we'd be fine. I told her that new stove would see us through. Hoskins said it was the best model he carried." He looked at Kate. "I laughed at you," he said. In my head, I laughed. "The crazy German widow building a brick monument. I thought you'd be dead by Christmas." Kate said nothing. Anderson wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "I was wrong," he said. "I was a fool, and you were right, and my boy is alive because of it." He took Niels home that afternoon, wrapped in every blanket Kate could spare. Word spread. Within a week, everyone in McPherson County knew the story: the Vogt widow's brick stove that held heat for 14 hours, the Anderson boy who survived because of it, the families who had nearly frozen while their iron stoves devoured furniture and still couldn't keep the cold at bay. Kate went to town on January 20th. Hoskins's general store was packed with survivors, people buying supplies they'd burned during the blizzard, people sharing stories of the storm. Hoskins saw Kate enter. The room went quiet. The man who had laughed at her brick order, who had predicted she'd be begging for coal by Christmas, who had sold the Anderson family the iron stove that nearly killed them. He walked toward her. His face was difficult to read. "Mrs. Vogt," he said. The whole room listened. "I heard about the Anderson boy," he continued. "What you did." Kate waited. "I also heard—" Hoskins stopped, started again. "My nephew's family. They had that new stove I sold them. They nearly froze. The children are still sick." Kate said nothing. I was wrong. The words cost him something. Kate could see it in the way he held his shoulders. I said that contraption wouldn't work. I was wrong. The admission hung in the air. "If you were willing," Hoskins continued, "I'd like to know more about how it's built. There might be others who'd want to know." Kate looked at the faces watching her. Neighbors who had laughed. Neighbors who had gossiped. Neighbors who had predicted her failure with cheerful certainty. She could refuse. She could let them freeze next winter like they'd expected her to freeze this one. Instead, she said yes. In Russia, she told them, the petch kept everyone warm. Rich, poor, old, young. It's not magic. It's just bricks arranged correctly. The response built slowly through February and March. 3 families requested Kate's help designing similar stoves. Old Zimmerman, suddenly in demand, spent his days drawing diagrams and explaining channel dimensions. The Eureka newspaper ran a short article, "German Method Proves Superior in Late Storm," that brought inquiries from as far away as Aberdeen. Kate didn't charge for her advice. She drew diagrams, explained the principles, helped others source materials. She remembered what it felt like to have nothing and no one to help. Martha Lindstrom visited in late February. She brought a pie and sat down at Kate's table without being invited. "I owe you an apology," she said. Kate shook her head. "You brought me bread when I was building. You sent your brother-in-law with the cart." "I thought you were going to fail," Martha said. I helped because I didn't want to see a woman alone with children starve. But I never believed the stove would work. I thought I was helping you prepare for a comfortable failure." She looked at the petch, at the children doing lessons at the table, at the warmth that filled the soddy even now in the dead of winter. "My husband and I talked about getting a bigger claim," Martha continued, "going further west. We decided against it because of the winters." She paused. "Maybe we were wrong." That spring, Martha hired a mason from Eureka to build her a smaller version of Kate's petch. It cost her $60 and 2 weeks of disruption. She never regretted a penny of it. Orville Pratt, the speculator, left McPherson County in April. Kate proved up her claim on schedule. The land patent arrived in June of 1888, 160 acres, free and clear, signed by the General Land Office in Washington. Pratt had been watching 3 claims that winter. All 3 survived. 2 of them belonged to German-Russian families who had built masonry stoves. The third belonged to a Norwegian widow who had spent her entire savings on coal and gotten lucky. The land speculation business didn't work when the settlers didn't fail. Pratt sold his holdings and moved to Wyoming, looking for easier marks. By the end of 1888, 7 new masonry stoves stood in McPherson County. By 1890, the number had doubled. By 1900, nearly every German-Russian homestead in the region had one. The technique spread quietly through immigrant communities in the Dakotas, Montana, and Minnesota. It never became mainstream. American industry favored cast iron and later gas and electric heat, but it never disappeared either. The schoolhouse blizzard became legend. January 12, 1888, the day the weather turned killer. Families told stories of survival and loss for generations. Kate's story was one of the small ones. No newspapers wrote about her. No historians recorded her name. She was simply a widow who built a stove and survived. But she taught over 40 families to build similar stoves during her lifetime. Several still exist in McPherson County, their bricks darkened by a century of fires, their channels still drawing smoke through the labyrinth, still releasing heat hour after hour into cold prairie nights. Kate Vogt completed her homestead requirements in the spring of 1888. The land was hers, 160 acres of Dakota territory that she and Heinrich had claimed together, that she had held alone through 2 winters and a blizzard that killed hundreds. In 1891, she remarried. Anton Becker was a German-Russian farmer from the Molochna colony, a widower himself with 2 daughters. They combined their claims, building the largest German-Russian homestead in McPherson County. Their new house had a petch that took 3 men 2 months to build. Kate designed it. She specified the channel dimensions, the firebox size, the height of the sleeping platform. When the masons made mistakes, she showed them how to fix it, the same way Zimmerman had shown her. Johann Vogt grew up to be a farmer, expanding his stepfather's holdings to 640 acres. Anna became a teacher at the same one-room schoolhouse Johann had walked to on the morning of the blizzard. Friedrich, the infant who had slept through the worst storm in Dakota history, grew up to run a general store in Eureka, in the same building where Hoskins had laughed at his mother's brick order. Kate lived to see her grandchildren. She lived to see the prairie she had nearly died on transformed into one of the most productive agricultural regions in America. She lived to see iron stoves give way to coal furnaces, give way to gas heating, give way to electric heat pumps. The petch in her original soddy, the one she built with bleeding hands in the summer of 1887, still stood when she died in 1923. It had been patched and repointed and repaired, but the structure was sound. The channels still drew smoke through the labyrinth. The bricks still held heat. Her grandchildren remembered sleeping on the platform when they visited. They remembered the warmth that radiated from the bricks all night long. They didn't understand then what their grandmother had built. They thought it was just an old stove. They didn't know that it had saved their parents' lives, that it had saved their grandmother from failure, that it represented knowledge stretching back through centuries to a time when people understood that the simplest solutions were often the best ones. In the 1970s, with energy crises making efficiency valuable again, engineers rediscovered the principles Kate Vogt had known by instinct. Organizations formed to preserve traditional masonry heater knowledge. Studies confirmed what Russian peasants had understood for 500 years. A properly designed masonry heater achieves 85 to 90% efficiency. It burns a third of the fuel that conventional stoves require. The techniques had never been lost. They had simply been ignored, dismissed as backward, abandoned in favor of modern solutions that turned out to be less effective. Kate Vogt knew this. So did Peter Zimmerman. So did the German-Russian immigrants who crossed an ocean carrying nothing but skills and memories. They built their stoves and survived. Their children built stoves and survived. Their grandchildren forgot why the stoves mattered, but the stoves kept working anyway. The McPherson County Historical Society keeps a photograph in its archive. Kate Vogt, approximately 1910, standing in front of the petch in her farmhouse. She is gray-haired and stern-faced, the way all pioneers look in photographs of that era. But there is something else in her eyes, something that might be pride or satisfaction, or simply the peace of a woman who bet everything and won. Behind her, barely visible in the photograph's depth, 3 figures rest on a brick platform, her grandchildren perhaps, sleeping in the warmth their grandmother built with her own hands. The caption reads, Katharina Becker, née Vogt, with the masonry stove she constructed in 1887, which saved her family during the schoolhouse blizzard of 1888. Below, in smaller text, Mrs. Becker taught over 40 families to build similar stoves during her lifetime. Several still exist in McPherson County. The neighbors who laughed spent $200 that winter on wood and nearly died anyway. Kate spent $50 on bricks and passed the technique to the next generation. The frontier was not conquered by those who had the most. It was settled by those who knew how to need less. Sometimes the knowledge that the world dismisses as backward is the only thing that stands between your family and the cold. Kate Vogt understood this. She built it into brick, and it kept her children warm while the blizzard howled outside, and the neighbors burned their furniture, and the skeptics learned finally that sometimes the old ways endure because they work.